So you go to use your water-fed window cleaning system, and you notice despite having everything all set up properly in the input, you're getting very low flow coming out of the DI. Well, stick around, you'll want to watch this video. Hey everyone, Mark here with another video, this time a guide on how to troubleshoot your RO/DI water-fed window cleaning system. Perhaps you've been using your system for a while, but you've noticed recently that you're not getting quite the same pressure as you were when this thing was brand new. Usually acts as a symptom, less water flow coming out of the final filter. Maybe it's a gradual change over several weeks, or maybe it could be a sudden change from one day to the next. Well, I'm going to help you troubleshoot this the same way as I would if a customer had bought a system from me and they called me up after several months, or they emailed me and said, hey, I'm not getting as much water, what's going on? So as mentioned, we are talking about RO/DI systems. So the RO in RO/DI stands for reverse osmosis. That's the biggest and most expensive filter in your system. In a typical three-stage system, it's a 40-inch RO. Some systems you might have two of these, or you might have two smaller 20-inch. Now, if you've heard about RO systems, you probably know that they are very pressure sensitive. Now, unfortunately, that might make a lot of people think that when they're getting poor water flow coming out of their system, that the RO is what's at fault. And that's actually just kind of looking at the symptom. That's not really looking at what the real fault is. So we're going to take you through step by step here. Now, the first thing I usually ask one of my clients who bought a system off me, I usually ask whether they've noticed a change from one day to the next, or has it been gradual. Usually if there's one day to the next, it could simply be a one-time occurrence, or maybe they've done something differently on that particular day that they haven't done in the past. Some situations could be that they've been using a two-jetted brush up to a certain point, and then they switched over to a four-jetted brush, or they've put on a rinse bar or something, and they're automatically thinking that they're going to get the same amount of water flow out of multiple jets as they were getting out of just a couple of jets. Well, obviously that's not the case. You're only going to get so much water out of a system. If you add more places for the water to have to come out, it's the same amount of water being spread through a lot more orifices, so it's not going to work quite the same. In some cases, you may just be in a situation where you're going to need a booster pump. But aside from that, if you are having a gradual or sudden change, and it's not anything to do with changing up your brush setup, more than likely the culprit is the very first filter. That is your pre-filter. This blocks chlorine as well as sediment. Some systems have a separate sediment filter and a separate carbon filter, but these are usually the filters that are the first culprits for restricting the water flow. Now, on a system like this, we actually have a pressure gauge on the system. Not all systems have that, but those who do, just so you know, that's not showing you the pressure that's going out of the system. That's actually showing you the pressure of what's going in just before the RO and just after the pre-filter. So if the pre-filter for whatever reason is clogged up, that pressure gauge is going to show low. So obviously the RO is not getting the amount of pressure required to put a good amount of water out. So even if you've changed the pre-filter recently, you have to understand that because you're a professional window cleaner and you're going from job to job, you never know what is floating through the customer's line. And so it's because of this scenario that I usually recommend that window cleaner run the garden hose for about a minute or so before they even hook it up to the system. That way ensuring that they're flushing out any gunk that's in the line instead of just putting it through here and messing up your more expensive filters, right? And on some systems you do have a clear housing, so you can quite often tell if it gets brown really fast, you know that you've been hooking up to some pretty dirty lines. Now the last thing I want to say about your pre-filter, whether it be a sediment or a carbon filter, is it may seem like a bit of a hassle to change this filter more often, but you have to kind of look at it like this. The fact that it got clogged up is a good thing, and I know that's kind of seems backwards, right? But the fact that it got clogged up meant that it didn't allow all that stuff to bypass and go through the system and to mess up your more expensive RO. RO is going to cost you 40 to 50 times more expensive than a pre-filter. And it's kind of like, getting your oil changed in your car, right? Maybe it's a hassle, maybe you don't like the expense, but would you much rather do that, or do you want to replace a more expensive engine somewhere down the line? So the last scenario you can see about getting low pressure going into the system is simply that you're in a low pressure area. Could be that you're used to doing jobs in the city where there's a lot of good water pressure, but now you're doing a job out in the suburbs or out in some rural area. Customer could be running off a well, Or it even could be that even though you've got the spigot turned fully on the outside of the house, the tap that's on the inside of the house that turns the water on to the outside could only be on partially. Sometimes customers will do that to conserve water. Maybe they just turn it on enough to run their sprinkler, a couple times a week, and that's it. So that's something to check out too. So the next culprit for low pressure, low water output, besides the pre-filtering or low incoming source pressure, would be, if you're thinking about the RO, you'd actually be wrong. I've been selling these systems for 10 years now, and I can't remember there ever being a time when the RO was at fault for having a lot of low water output. The actual next culprit, believe it or not, are system leaks. It could be leaks where you've got threaded fittings, it could be leaks where you have tubing going into push fittings, or it could even be the housings themselves. So most manufacturers recommend that you run their systems lying down horizontally. So when performing a system leak test, I recommend that you do that, but on a nice flat surface such as a driveway or sidewalk. I know a lot of window cleaners, they like to put this out on the lawn. The problem with that though is you can have some long grass on that lawn and it's going to mask anywhere where there's a system leak on the system. So once you get it up on a nice clean surface, what I want you to make sure you do is have a towel, wipe down any water that might already be on the system. Could be when you were hooking it up, some water gone on the system, whatever. You want to start off with everything nice and dry and then start running water through. Check all your threaded fittings, any tubing going into push fittings, and of course your housings. For threaded fittings, if you've seen any of my other videos, it's simply a case of taking out the fitting, wrapping some fresh plumber's tape, putting that back on. Tubing, if there's any leaks there, it's usually simply because the tubing, maybe in transport got pulled out a little bit. Usually just pushing the tubing back in, that will be, sufficient. If you do have a broken fitting at all, certainly order up a new one. But I'm going to tell you about an interesting scenario, and I've seen this 3 times this year. And that is the O-ring scenario, which is called the O-ring scenario. So the window cleaner, he needed to change one of his filters. So he's opened it up. This is the pre-filter. They've taken out the old filter, said, okay, it's time to change out the new. And what do? They dump out the water that's in there, grab the new cartridge, whatever, put it in, screw it back into place. Only problem is they didn't notice that when they tossed out that water, they tossed out something very important. See, on the inside of housings, whether it be a pre-filter or a DI, there's usually either on top or deeper inside a nice rubber O-ring. It's that O-ring that makes sure that when you tighten this by hand after changing out a filter, that this thing is airtight and watertight. Now I've seen scenarios where they've dumped that, they didn't even notice it, it goes off into the garden bed, then they put everything all back together, operating their system, and like I said, they're doing it on the grass and they're not even noticing a lot of water is coming out of the housing. So what happens in that is the system is no longer pressurized. I've seen scenarios where simply putting getting a new O-ring, putting it in, hooking everything up, doubles the water output. So it's amazing. It's just, like I said, you got to do this test on a nice flat surface where you can see everything that's going on. And speaking of changing out filter cartridges, I've seen this happen too. A window cleaner, maybe they bought a system and they're going to be changing out their DI for the very first time. So they take out the DI cartridge from the housing, they unscrew, they dump out the old resin, scoop in some new fresh resin, and then instead of putting this cartridge in back the same way they took it out, and it's usually indicated by an arrow, it has an arrow on the side of it, what they do is they actually stick it in upside down. It fits, right? So they put it all back and the thing doesn't function properly. In order for a DI cartridge to work properly, what happens is water enters into the housing, fills up, there's slits on the bottom of this end cap for water to go through, up through the DI, so it can do a final polishing of the water, and then finally through the center here to the output, where there's a center spindle inside here, and then it'll go to the output of the system. Now on some systems, you actually have a valve to switch between flush mode and run mode. On this particular system here, they have a graphic, a little symbol that shows you the waste. With it higher in this position here, most of the water is going towards the waste. But when you turn it into there, it minimizes the amount of water going to waste, and the rest is going to go redirected over to the DI and to the output. Now, it is possible for people just to not think about it, and they leave it in the waste flush position. It's usually pretty obvious because a lot of water is coming out of the waste side of the system. But if you do have this up here, or maybe you have it partially, you didn't even go all the way fully over to the run position, that can certainly reduce the amount of water going over to your DI, out to the pole hose, and then up to your brush. So that's something to definitely check out for. So now that brings us to the RO. If there is an actual problem with the RO as far as pressure going through it, a good telltale sign, without even having to open up the system itself, is to check how it's reducing the TDS. A new or fairly new RO membrane should be reducing the incoming TDS by up to about 95%. Now you can test that simply by taking the tube that goes from the output of the RO to the input of the DI. If you're not sure which one that is, just locate your DI, the fitting going into it, there's a tubing here. You can just pull that out, sample the water, see if it's 95% lower than what the incoming tap TDS is. Even if it's like 90, you're pretty good. Usually about 80%, when it's only reducing 80%, that's when you're going to change out the RO. The reason why I'm saying this to test the TDS, because if the RO is not working effectively as far as pressure, it's not going to be able to even reduce the TDS properly. So if it is reducing the TDS properly, then you definitely know it's not the RO. And the last case scenario, and like I said, I've never had this really happen. You can open up the RO housing, pop it open, take a look, see if there's any debris just sitting on top going, before the RO filter in there. But that would mean that this pre-filter has failed, if that's the scenario. So I really doubt that that's the likely cause. Okay, so a final wrap up of our checklist to find out what's causing low pressure and low water output. Of course, the pre-filter, have you changed it recently? Could there be a scenario where it got gunked up really quickly? Definitely always carry a spare with you. They're not expensive. It's always handy to have a spare with you so you can swap them out on the fly. And of course, checking out your incoming tap pressure. Could be a one-case scenario where you just go to one place and it's bad, and then you go back to your regular clients or you go back home and everything's fine. Definitely whenever you're performing a test though, do it in a place where you know the pressure is good. Could be at your home, could be if you have your stuff stored at a warehouse or something, someplace where you got good pressure. Of course, check for system leaks, any threaded fittings. If they're leaking, just plumber's tape, put them back on. Make sure any tubings that are going into push fittings are pushed in nice and tight. Of course, your housings, any O-rings, make sure there's no leaks anywhere there because you're going to lose a lot of pressure. Cartridges are in the right way. Of course, you have any gauges or any dials, levers or whatever in the right positions whenever you're trying to perform window cleaning. Other than that, you can always reach out to the manufacturer, but a lot of these things solve 99% of the issues I've ever seen in the industry in the last 10 years. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I hope you found this helpful. Bye for now.